chlokes in the Gemara between the Amoraim who debate whether it is necessary to complete Kriya Shema immediately before you fall asleep, because there's this imperative to protect yourself from injurious spirits or shadim, what are called shadim or mazikin, when you fall asleep. So it's on that basis, there was one opinion in the Gemara that a rabbi told his students, there's no need to create an adjacency, since you only have until midnight to recite the Shema. If you plan to stay up late and you want to learn, say the Shema before you start learning, then you can learn all night, and whenever you fall asleep, you fall asleep. But the other opinion that we saw yesterday was to the contrary, that you need to make sure that you recite Kriya Shema right before you fall asleep. We saw this story from yesterday that Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani was hiding in Rabbi Yaakov Gross's house behind the baskets to see how he would fall asleep. And he noted that he recited the Shema while he was in his bed in his pajamas, and he wasn't falling asleep right away. So he repeated Kriya Shema, and it sounds like he kept repeating it until he finally was overcome with sleep and he fell asleep. The question is, how do we translate that into halacha? And I mentioned to you this concept from the Abu Dirham, Rabbi David Abu Dirham, which I'll get to in just a moment. But I want to finish the text of the Gemara first. So the Gemara we're up to says Umay Taima, which is let's see, 3, 6. It's like 9 lines from the bottom on Zayin Amud Beis, and it says Umay Taima. What's the reason? In other words, or really more correctly, we say my time is what's the reason, but in the Yerushalmi parlance, it's what's the source for this concept that you have to create an adjacency between your Kriya Shema and your sleep. Rav Acha v'Rabbi Tachlifa Chamoy Amru b'Shem Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman. So Rabbi Acha and Rabbi Tachlifa, his father-in-law, in the name of Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman, said as follows. The pasuk in Tehillim says, Rigzu va'al techetau. It says, be filled with roges, filled with either fright or emotion, and do not sin. Imru vilvavchem al mishkavchem. Speak in your hearts on your beds. Vidomu sela, and then be silent, sela. And the word sela defies sometimes explanation, but it usually implies the end or completed. And so, what does it mean, imru bilvavchem? Speak in your hearts. What is, because the Torah says, v'hayu hadivarim ha'ela asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levabecha. The Shema is something that's supposed to be on your hearts. So therefore, when the pasuk says imru vilvavchem, say something that will be in your hearts, it's a reference to the Shema. And now, but then the Gemara points out that milte de Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi pliga. From the following story, we can infer that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi disagrees, and he holds that you are allowed to interrupt between Shema and sleep. The Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi kari mizmorim batra, because Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, when he would say Kriyat Shema Lamita, he would recite mizmorim, and then afterwards he would fall asleep. Now, what is the term mizmorim? So, if you look at the footnote 14, he says the Gemara in Masechet Shavuot, the Bavli in Masechet Shavuot, says that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi would say the Psalm Yoshev B'Seser Elyon, Psalm 91, which is something that we recite every Shabbos, which talks about God's providence over the righteous. So he did say that also to protect him from shadim, but he didn't feel that Shema was the specific formula that you needed to recite to protect you from mazikin. Okay, so therefore you see that you don't dafka have to say those specific words of Shema immediately before you fall asleep. You can say other things as well. So the Hatane Ein Omer Devarim Achar Emes V'Yatziv. But didn't we just learn previously in the Brisa that you're not allowed to say anything after you say the bracha after Kriya Shema, after Emes V'Yatziv? So Patar Lei be'Emes V'Yatziv Shel Shacharis. So he explained that Brisa, when it says that you're not allowed to say anything after Emes V'Yatziv, is not a reference to Kriyat Shema at night, but it's a reference to Kriyat Shema in the morning. When you and I say Emes V'Yatziv, remember I said before, at night we say Emes Ve'emuna, and in the morning we say Emes V'Yatziv. So we said the Gemara overlooks that because it could be the minhag in the times of the Gemara was to say Emes V'Yatziv both in the morning and in the night. But this opinion says the Brisa is specifically referring to the morning, meaning that after you say Shema and after you say Emes V'Yatziv, you're not allowed to say anything else before what? Before davening Shmona Esrei. So that's a completely different way of understanding this Brisa, and that's actually how we paskin. Demar Rebbe Zeira b'shem Rebbe Abba Bar Yirmiyah Shalosh Techifos, because Rabbi Zeira, in the name of Rabbi Abba Bar Yirmiyah, said that there are three adjacencies, three things that you have to do immediately after the other. What are the three things? Techef lismicha shchita. Immediately after, when you're bringing an animal sacrifice, you press down on the animal's head. We know that. That's the concept called smicha, not rabbinic smicha, right? But it's the same word, by the way, because what does smicha mean? It means placing hands on the head. So when a rabbi would get ordained in the old days, the senior rabbi from the Sanhedrin would place his hands on his head to ordain him, to instill him with the authority.
But that is sort of simply what we do with our children Friday, right?
It's a type of smicha. Yeah, it's a type of smicha. Yeah, sure. We don't call it that, right? But the real smicha, where the Torah says, v'samach yado, that he shall press with his hands, is a reference to bringing korbanos, where the bringer of the korban has to press down his hands on the head of the animal to create an association, both a physical and a psychological and a spiritual association between himself and the animal, so that whatever's happening to that animal is a vicarious representation of what should happen to me, right? And so immediately after smicha, you have to do shchita. You can't have any interruption or pause. Number two, tekef l'netilas yadayim bracha. Immediately after you do netilas yadayim, you're supposed to start your meal, meaning you're supposed to say hamotzi. There cannot be any interruption between washing your hands and saying hamotzi, which is, of course, why we talked about yesterday, right? Okay. And the third one is tekef legeula tefillah. Immediately after you say the bracha of Ga'al Yisrael, you have to immediately launch into Shmona Esrei. Now, we're going to analyze, so the Gemara then brings the source for this. What is the source? Tekef l'smicha shchita, and we just turned the page, now we're on Ches Amud Aleph. How do we know that immediately after you do smicha, you have to do shchita? Because the Torah says, v'samach v'shachat. Because you look at the verses in the Torah, and it says, he shall place his hand on the head of the burnt offering, v'shachat. And then the pasuk immediately after says, he shall slaughter. Okay, so that's how we know from the verses themselves. Tekef l'netilas yadayim bracha. How do I know that immediately after you wash your hands, you're supposed to say hamotzi? Because as it says in Tehillim, Su'u yedechem kodesh uvarachu es Hashem. It says in Tehillim, lift up your hands for holiness, which is what we do. That's called netilat yadayim. What does the word netila literally mean? Netila is to raise up. Litol, to lift up. So what the question is, why is it called netilat yadayim and not rechitzat yadayim, for example, which is washing the hands? We call it washing, but really it's the lifting up of the hands because you're elevating your hands both physically and spiritually to make them ritually pure. It's why people, after they wash, they lift up their hands when they say the bracha. That's really, it's brought down in halacha. That's what you're supposed to do. So the pasuk in Tehillim says, "To yedechem kodesh," lift up your hands in holiness, ubaruchu es Hashem, and bless Hashem. And then thirdly, takef l'geula tefillah. How do I know that immediately before you daven Shmona Esrei, you have to have the adjacency of Baruch atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael, blessed are you God, who redeems Israel, meaning the bracha right after Kriya Shema, as it says in the pasuk in Tehillim, Yihiyu l'ratzon imrei fi, may the words of my mouth be pleasing to you, v'hegyon libi lefanecha, and the feelings of my heart before you, Hashem tzuri v'goali. God, you are my rock and my redeemer. And so it seems like this bracha is a preparation or an expression of how I'm about to say the Amidah. That's how the sages understand it. But by the fact that we call God Tsuri v'Goali, my rock and my redeemer, what's the last part of the bracha of Gal Yisrael? Tsur Yisrael, Kuma be'ezras Yisrael, Ufdechi numecha Yudav Yisrael, Go Aleinu Hashem Tzavakot Shemo Kadosh Yisrael, Baruch atah Hashem Gal Yisrael. So you have both the word Tsur and you have the idea, which is the rock. God is my rock and my protector, and the idea of Geula. So this pasuk, Hashem Tsuri v'Goali, is that the last things that I should be thinking about is my previous utterance of Tzur Yisrael, Baruch atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael, and immediately I launch to Imrei Fi, the words of my mouth and the feelings of my heart, which is an expression of the Amidah. Uma ketiv batre, and what does it say right afterwards? Ya'amcha Hashem biyom tzara. Immediately afterwards, in the next paragraph of Tehillim, it says, God will respond to you on a day of travail, meaning that God will respond to your prayers. So therefore, that too is a reference to the Amidah. And from here you see that Shmona Esrei has to be adjacent to Tzur Yisrael and Ga'al Yisrael. Now, we're going to pause here, and we're going to come back to this idea. But I wanted us to take a look at the halacha, because it seems that there's some equivocation from the Gemara as to how a person should comport himself before he goes to bed. On the one hand, we saw a very strict policy from one Amora that you can't do anything before you go to bed. Once you've recited Kriya Shema, that's it, fall asleep. If you can't fall asleep, what are you supposed to do? Recite Kriya Shema again and again and again until you fall asleep. Is there such a policy in halacha? So the other opinion is that that there's no need to do so, and you're allowed to either learn Torah, or you can say other psukim, or you can engage in other things, but it's not clear what the final analysis is. So what I wanted to do is I had a little time after Shacharis yesterday, and I was able to do a little sniffing around. I just wanted to share with you, if you want to just turn off the fluorescence. You don't have to dim them. Just turn off one, Al, turn off the one on the left. There you go. Okay. And I'm going to share the screen for those who are watching on the video in TV land. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to share with you, if you remember, I said that years ago I had studied this psak from the Abu Dirham. Rabbi David Abu Dirham lives I believe he lives in the 1400s, early 1400s. So he's a relatively late Rishon, a late early medievalist. Okay, that's what we call, the early medievalists, we call them Rishonim, and they have a greater sense of authority. The Abu Dirham is referenced by the Shulchan Aruch a number of times, and it's also it's considered to be the authoritative early commentary on the Siddur. So he has this paragraph where he talks about the bracha of Elokai Neshama that we say in the morning. What is, if I were to ask you, we say multiple brachas in the morning in Birchos HaShachar. What stands out as one bracha is not like the other? What makes Elokai Neshama different from all of the other brachot that we say in the morning?
We'll start with the Baruch.
Exactly. Exactly. It does not start with the words Baruch Ata Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, Elokai neshama shenosata b'tohorehi. And that's the normal format when you have a bracha with multiple words. It starts with Baruch and it ends with a bracha. Okay, that's the format that the Gemara discusses in Talmud Brachos, Maseches Brachos. So the Abu Dirham asks the question, that's really what he's dealing with. Why does Elokai Neshama not start with the words Baruch Ata Hashem? Elokai Neshama, bracha zu ena potachas bebaruch. He says this bracha does not start with the words Baruch Ata Hashem. V'lo mipnei shehi samucha lebirchas asher yatzar. It's not because it's an adjacent bracha. The exception to the rule that a bracha normally has to start with Baruch Ata Hashem is if it's a bracha that is adjacent to a bracha that's said immediately before it. What would be some examples of this? When we recite the Amidah. All of the 18 blessings, the 19 brachas of the Amidah, only the first one starts with Baruch. All subsequent blessings of the Amidah do not start with the word Baruch. Why is that? It's because the Gemara's opinion is the standard format of a bracha, you open with Baruch Ata Hashem, you end with Baruch Ata Hashem if it's more than just a one-liner, okay? If it's got multiple words. If, however, you're reciting a series of paragraph brachot, then you only end with Baruch because the ending of the previous bracha acts as the opening to the next bracha as well. So therefore, we start with Baruch Ata Hashem, Elokeinu ve'Elokei Avoseinu, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak ve'Elokei Yaakov. So we start the Amidah with Baruch Ata Hashem, but then what's the next Magen Avraham? We end that first bracha with Magen Avraham, and then what do we open up with? Ata Gibor Le'olam Hashem. We don't start the second bracha with Baruch Ata Hashem, because the words Magen Avraham not only act as the ending for the first bracha, but they also act as the opening for the second bracha. So that obviates the need for a Baruch Ata Hashem for the second bracha, which is known as the bracha of Gevuros. Okay? Ata Gibor Le'olam Hashem. So some want to argue that the reason why Elokai Neshama does not start with Baruch Ata Hashem is for the technical issue that it comes immediately after the prior bracha. Now, I challenge you to look in your siddur and see if that's actually the way it's printed in your siddur. Does Elokai Neshama indeed follow Asher Yotzar? No, it actually doesn't in the siddur. But the Mishnah Berurah says you should say it after Elokai Neshama, after Asher Yotzar. So some say that that's the reason. Dehamrina b'perak haroeh, he says, but you can't say that because the Gemara in the Bavli says, Ki mitar lema hachi Elokai neshama. He says, when you wake up in the morning, your very first bracha should be Elokai neshama. He says, Ubirkas asher yatzar omer levada b'chol eisha ositzrachav. And the bracha of asher yatzar is not something that was ordained to be said always immediately before Elokai neshama. Elokai neshama was an independently ordained bracha to be said when you wake up in the morning, and Asher Yatzar is anytime you go to the washroom, anytime you relieve yourself, you say the bracha of Asher Yatzar. So you can't say that they're interdependent, so that Elokai Neshama always follows Asher Yatzar.
But normally when people wake up in the morning, that's what they're doing.
Normally that's what we do. But what if you have an unusual constitution and you wake up and you don't have to pish, right? You still would say Elokai Neshama. even if you don't have to go to the bathroom for another hour. Okay? So, Elapiresh Haravid, Mipnei Shehisamucha Lebirkas Hamapil Chevle Sheina Al Einai. So the Ravid, who's an earlier Rishon, suggested the reason why Elokai Neshama does not start with Baruch is because it is adjacent to a prior bracha. What bracha did you say immediately before falling asleep the night before? Hamapil. You said the bracha of Hamapil. Hamapil chavlei sheina aleinoi usnum alaf apoy. God, I thank you for allowing sleep to fall over me, and I ask that you protect me over the course of the evening. Hamachazir neshamos. What's the ending? Hamir lelam kulo bichvodo. You illuminate the entire universe with your glory, and that's the end of the bracha, and then you fall asleep, and then you're not supposed to speak. So the immediately adjacent opening bracha is Elokai Neshama. When you wake up, boom, okay. Forget about Netilas Yadayim. We'll put that aside for just a second. We'll put that aside for a second. We'll pretend that that's not part of this canon. That's not part of this law. And the first thing you say is Elokai Neshama. It's a bracha hasmucha lechaberta. It's adjacent to the bracha that I finished last night before I fell asleep. And that's the reason why it doesn't need an opening baruch. He says, Vishena, exactly anticipating Hal's question, Eina hafsaka. It's not a hefsek. Mipnei she'ena ma'aseh. Because you're doing nothing. You're not doing anything. You're not thinking anything. You're not doing anything.
Not talking to
You're
your
not talking to your wife. Nothing. You just immediately before you fell asleep, you finish the bracha of Hamapil, and then when you wake up, you say Elokai Neshama. So comes along the Abu Dirham and he says, the kasha li lidvarav. He says, I have a difficulty with this interpretation. Shaharei I efshar shelo yikayim mitzvahs ona. He says a man is obligated to please his wife. A man has conjugal responsibilities. And if I have conjugal responsibilities, v'tzarich sheyasuach kodem sheyashamish mitaso. And part of my conjugal responsibility is to speak with my wife, is to do foreplay. And what is foreplay? It's to stimulate her before we engage in the actual act. And part of that is to talk to her. You're so beautiful. I can't believe you're my wife. I love you. All of these things that you're supposed to say to your wife before. Kideisa beperak haroa, as it says in the Gemara itself. You're obligated to speak to your wife before you provide her with your conjugal responsibilities. And therefore, how can you tell me that there's no hefsek between the bracha of Hamapil and Elokai Neshama? What about the conversation with your wife? So thank God, I woke up one day when I was a young married man and I said, he gets it. Rabbi David Abu Dirham, as a frum person, says Hamapil, what is that? What is that? What is that? You're supposed to pantomime marital intimacy, right? Come on, give me a break.
Is that the only excuse we can find?
So 1 second. So as we're going to see that there is a spectrum of attitudes as far as how pious a person is supposed to be in this regard of this bracha. And you're seeing this tension in the Yerushalmi as well. So he says, and therefore, but based on that, the Abu Dirham says, that cannot be the reason why we don't open with the words Baruch Atah Hashem when we say the bracha Elokai Neshama, because we haven't said a word since the night before. That's not practical. That's not human, okay? He says, V'hanachon kamo shepirish Rabbeinu Tam. And so the correct interpretation is as Rabbeinu Tam said, She'eno posachas bebaruch mipnei shehi birkas hada'ah He says there's another technical reason. It's a blessing of thanksgiving. Moda l'shem shehechzer lo nishmaso lihisno eyaba v'lakum baboker lasos tzirachav. That you're giving thanks to God. And apparently the opinion of the Abu Dirham is that when you're giving a blessing of thanksgiving of this nature, this is the one kind of bracha that doesn't require you to open with Baruch Atah Hashem. But I'm thanking God that you gave me the ability, you returned my soul to me, that allows me to be animated, to arise in the morning, to perform all of my daily responsibilities. She'im eno makdim techila hoda'a, he says that if you're not going to express why you're thankful first, alma shetachul habracha havi labracha levatala. Therefore, before you can even say the words Baruch, you have to give verbal expression to why you're so thankful to Hashem for what he's just done to you. So first you have to make mention of the fact, God, now that I'm awake, I realize you've given me back my neshama. Baruch atah Hashem. Blessed are you, Hashem. Hamachazir neshamos lifkarim mesim, that you return souls to dead bodies. Meaning I was an empty shell. I was a dead person when I was unconscious, so to speak. And you've resurrected me. You brought me back to life now that I'm able to wake up and perform my daily responsibilities. That's, according to the Abu Dirham, the reason. But I wanted us to see this. And now that we've seen this, we're going to continue with some of, and then yesterday, amazingly, I saw that there is a whole commentary on the Yerushalmi that is not printed in our art scroll, that has a whole discussion of the variety of halachic positions on this idea of silence after Shema, any interruptions between Shema and falling asleep. But just one last thing before I let you go is this quote from the Kaf HaChaim. The Kaf HaChaim is the Sephardi parallel to the Mishnah Berurah. The Kaf HaChaim is referenced. He's Rav Shimon Sofer, Rav Yaakov Sofer, who is considered to be the preeminent psak for Sephardic communities. But we quote the Kaf HaChaim in Ashkenazi communities as well, just like they will sometimes quote the Mishnah Berurah in Sephardic communities. He says, he also brings this idea that you have to speak with your wife before. He says that and that you have to speak with your wife before intimacy with her. And so let me just so I'll get to the let's see. And then I have this paragraph. Where is it from? It's from a sefer that references. This is from Rav Aaron Yehuda Grossman, a more contemporary posek, and he's talking about, is it absolutely necessary to be silent after you recite Kriya Shema Lamita before falling asleep? And he says that there are many arguments to be made that would allow you to speak after you've recited Hamapil and you've said Kriya Shema Lamita. He says, let me bring you another proof. He says, Od Raya Matsasi Bekaf HaChaim. Yibeshem Yafel Lev, Ostalid, the Yachol L'Shamish Mitaso Acher Shekara Kriyashma, Ubirech Birkas Hamapil. He says that you're allowed to be intimate with your wife after you recited Kriya Shema Lamita. Like what? Well, like what are you going to say? A man has to be sexually repressed because he's already recited Kriya Shema Lamita. That's it, honey. I've closed for the night. I can't. We can't do anything spontaneous because I've already recited Kriya Shema Lamita. That's absurd, right? No one's going to tell you that you've got to be so puritanical, I guess, would be one way of putting it. He says, Uvesimin reish mem mavur diyesh ledaber kodem tashmish. He says, like the Abu Dirham said, you have to speak with your wife before intimacy. So that proves that you don't have to be a mute just because you've already recited Kriya Shema Lamita. V'chein kasav eshel Avraham sham, harei de mitzvos mutarim lasos gam acher birkas hamapil. So therefore, if you're engaged in doing a mitzvah and that mitzvah requires you to speak, of course, you're allowed to do that even after you recited Hamapil. And we'll take a look at the commentary, Be'ezras Hashem. This is a commentary called, what is it called? It's a commentary on the Yerushalmi from Rav Shmuel David ben Yom Tov Lipa HaKohen Friedman, called Sedate Sofim. The Sedate Sofim, which is a printed commentary on the Yerushalmi, launches into this whole explanation of this whole Gemara that we've learned, and he'll give us the opinions in the Shulchan Aruch itself. So we'll hold it for today. Have a